Lecture 7, The Republican Roots of Western Civilization. As we begin today, I take you back to Daniel, back in the late 6th century, as he interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had seen a vision of a statue made out of different types of metal, and wanted to understand what it meant, and so he asked the wise men, and God gave Daniel an understanding of what the dream had been and its understanding. In this dream, the statue is completed as we come down the body to legs that are made of iron and clay. In Daniel chapter 2, what we find Daniel telling King Nebuchadnezzar is that the statue, in verse 33, its legs were of iron, its feet partially of iron and partially of baked clay. Yet at the same time, while you were watching, a rock was cut out, not by human hands, and struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron and the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time. It became like chaff on the threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain, filling the whole earth. As we drop down in chapter 2, what we find is that the interpretation is given, an explanation of this vision, that God would set up a sequence of kingdoms, and eventually one that would never be destroyed. But this fourth kingdom, this one made with iron and baked clay, was going to be a divided kingdom. We find in verse 41, it would have great strength, even as iron would have strength. But as it was mixed clay and iron, it would be brittle, partially strong and partially brittle. And so the people of this kingdom would be a mixture, and they wouldn't remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. God, who knows about the rise and fall of empires, knew about the coming of the Romans. We see his foreknowledge in this, and his providence. We see how God works in time and within his purposes to accomplish his design, namely the restoration of people made in his image to himself. But now this empire that is envisioned by Daniel is not one that Daniel in his day would have ever imagined. At the point when Daniel was seeing this vision, Rome was just a little tiny city-state, oppressed by others, and an unlikely candidate to become the ruler of the world. But God in his providence would use these people to accomplish his purposes, and to bring about a situation where Jesus would be born in fulfillment of prophecies and establish the great kingdom that we're a part of that lasts forever. God employed the Romans to help create a suitable context for the coming of Jesus Christ and the establishment of his kingdom here on earth. The pagan Romans were to dominate the world, but they didn't see that the true God was using them to accomplish his purposes he had set in motion from the beginning of time. And what we're going to find is that the New Testament affirms that predictions like those of the prophet Daniel and those of Isaiah were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. We'll see how God works in history to accomplish his purposes and also to establish the culture of which we're a part. And we can just imagine at how he's working through our culture and us in this time. As I was saying, Rome was an unlikely candidate to become the terrifying beast that's envisioned in Daniel chapter 7 in his second rendition of the sequence of kingdoms. To become such a terrifying beast, well, back in the time of Daniel, like I said, it's a little city-state struggling to survive. As with our other societies that have contributed to Western civilization, we want to start by looking at the physical setting of Rome. It's located on the long peninsula of Italy that sticks down into the Mediterranean Sea and looks like a big boot kicking the football of Sicily. This geo-feature pretty much divides the Mediterranean into an eastern and a western sector. On the west side of the Italian peninsula, that boot, there are a series of small coastal plains. In the middle of all this was the plains of Latium, and it was a plain that was cut by the Tiber River as it drained towards the sea. And so the location for Rome would be on the banks of the Tiber River, where it was able to be forded, where you could cross the river with your animals. And so it's something of a strategic location, as the city is located on a pathway by which you can go north and south, up and down the coast, between the plains of Champagne and the plains of Etruria to the north, going through the plains of Latium. So the Tiber is able to be forded at this point. It's shallow enough that you can drive animals across, and later they're going to build bridges, but this is a strategic location. It has some limited access to the sea by way of water, and it has water supply for the people who would live there, but this location is surrounded by defensible hilltops, so there's a sequence of hills. Traditionally, Rome is understood to be built on 7 hills. As we go there today, we might find there's more hills that we might count, but they would count 7 hills. The city of Rome was one that's located there in the middle of the Italian peninsula, there in the Mediterranean Sea, in latitudes where they tend to get wet winters and have hot, dry summers. There is sufficient moisture for agriculture in the fields that do exist nearby, and the fields have some agricultural potentials, fertility for growing grains, which would help small communities to grow. Now, the Italian peninsula does have a series of mountains that run down its length. These mountains are known as the Apennine Mountains. Further to the north, where Italy connects to Europe, you have the Alps, large series of mountains, and in the north there's a valley that the Po River drains towards the Adriatic Sea. But Rome begins as just another little city-state. It's emerging at a time period when Greek city-states are similarly emerging, and it's going to grow to be something of a regional power and eventually a world power. As I said, its central Mediterranean location gave it some advantages there, as it's going to grow and eventually look to the sea to expand and to claim the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Romans struggle to survive early on, and their survival is something that is used by God. But where did the Romans originate? Well, according to their legends, produced by people like Virgil in his Aeneid, what we find is that Rome is projected to have been developed by a survivor of the wars of the Achaeans against the people of Troy. Aeneas is seen to be a person of Troy who survives that battle to come and establish what will be Rome and Roman society. But as we move on and read other Roman stories, we find the stories of Romulus and Remus. And Romulus gives his name to the city of Rome. According to the stories of Livy, these are twin brothers who are supposed to be killed, but yet they survive as they're abandoned and they're suckled by a she-wolf. Romulus becomes a fratricide, however, when he takes his plow and he plows around the city that he's going to establish on the banks of the Tiber, throwing up a sod as he turns over a little bit of dirt, and yet his brother Remus ridiculed his walls, as that clod represented the initial walls, and as a result, in a rage, Romulus kills Remus. So these are some of the stories that the Romans had about their origins, and certainly they do have connections that we can find culturally with other people groups. They seem to be an Indo-European group as far as their language goes and other factors that we might look at. But God's going to use this people in accomplishing his purposes. As we move beyond the legends that the Romans themselves preserved at later times, what we find is there's some artifactual evidence of people building structures there in Rome. They're not terribly imposing early on, but that seems to develop within the context of people living there in Italy and migrations of people back this time of great tumult when you have the Dorian invasions and the like. According to Roman tradition, the city is founded in our year 753 BC. This would be their year 1, and a date from which they would mark their time, and when they put on their coins a date, it would be relative to this date. This would be their year 1, and you find sometimes the letters AUC on their coins, and this stands for the Latin term. It abbreviates the Latin term ab urbe condita. from the founding of the city. So back in the 8th century, back in the time period of the divided monarchy of the Israelites and the kingdom of Judea, you have the beginnings of the city, which are projected. This city, early on, was dominated by the Etruscans, a people group who lived in the plains of Etruria, just to the north. The Etruscans' origins are somewhat lost to us, but they appear to have been connected to the Mycenaeans in Asia Minor, and they're going to pass on a number of things to the Romans. But the Etruscan kings dominate the Romans for a couple of centuries. And in their domination, sometimes they run roughshod over Roman feelings and sensitivities. And the last of these kings, according to Roman stories, is a king by the name of Tarquin. He gets the epithet Tarquin the Proud. But Tarquin the Proud presumed that he could get away with the rape of Lucretia, a Roman matron, who eventually responds to this outrage by committing suicide, and it mobilizes the men of Rome to throw off the Etruscan kings and establish their own territory independent of the Etruscans. Now, early on, the Romans are going to struggle against the Etruscans to maintain their independence, but as they're a small people group living in a slightly fortified location by the fords of the Tiber, they would be challenged by some of their neighbors. Neighbors like the Equi, who would challenge them, and as a result they would call upon military champions to go and rescue them. So early on we have heroes like Cincinnatus. He gives his name to the Society of Cincinnati and the American Revolutionary officers, who took up arms and authority and then relinquished them when the threat was gone. The old general went from plowing his fields to taking up command of armies, and after defeating the Equi, after just having 15 days of authority, or what the Romans called imperium, he's conquered the Roman enemies, and then he goes back to farming and he relinquishes his imperium. This will be something that many people fail to do along the way. They get caught up with power and cling to it too long. But he's seen as an ideal citizen. Another Roman hero that comes from early on would be the story we find in Livy of Horatio, another Roman soldier who, when the Romans are threatened, stands and defends the bridge over the Tiber River at the risk of his own life, and holds the enemies off at the bridge until those soldiers behind him are able to destroy the bridge, and so he gains great renown for risking his life at the bridge to protect his people. This idea of protecting this society comes to be very, very important. Beyond these early neighbors that challenged the Romans, a severe threat comes along in the year 390 BC with the invasion of the Celts. The Romans would know these people as the Gauls. The Gauls came from up north, from the area of the Po River Valley, and as they pressed southward, they would actually sack Rome and eventually leave when they're bought off by being given a ransom in gold. There continued to be squabbles amongst the Romans and their neighbors. A nearby people group were known as the Samnites, and there would be a war between the Samnites and the Latin-speaking people of Rome. But Rome, as it interacts with its neighbors and eventually defeats them, wisely extends certain privileges to their Latin-speaking allies. This will build a sense of Roman identity. Things Roman. And they stand in contrast with the Greeks. The Greeks who lived in Magna Graecia, in the plains of to the south of Rome, in cities like Neapolis, which becomes Naples later on, found themselves being challenged by the Romans, and so as a result they appealed to their fellow Greek champion, a fellow by the name of Pyrrhus, who is the king from just across the Adriatic, and they appealed to him for assistance in fighting against the Romans. In this war, Pyrrhus won every battle, but he lost the war. The victories were at such huge cost that he couldn't sustain the battle. And so today we sometimes talk about Pyrrhic victories. These are victories that cost too much, where you may win the battle, but ultimately you lose the war. Some other external challenges to the Romans would include competitors in the form of another city-state. These would be the Carthaginians. They were originally a colony of the Phoenicians over in what we know today as Lebanon, who had come and settled in the north coast of Africa in the location of the modern-day country of Tunisia. The Carthaginians had aspirations for expansion, just like the Romans, and they'd expanded from North Africa across the 100 miles or so between Tunisia and the island of Sicily, and they would be in competition with the Romans for Sicily. In Sicily, they had fields that could grow grain crops, and as their population grew, they wanted the grain crops. They also liked the strategic position that Sicily had in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So as we start out this war that happens between the Carthaginians and the Romans, the first phase, sometimes known as the First Punic War, lasted from 264 until 241. The Carthaginians had the advantage as being a seafaring people early on, but the Romans were a quick study and learned to develop ships from which they could launch their marines. The strategy that helped them become victorious was when they learned to develop something known as the corvus. This is essentially a grappling hook, whereby they would grab other ships that sailed close by and quickly haul them alongside and then board that ship and capture it. As a result of their improved naval abilities, the Romans were able to defeat the Carthaginians and to capture the island of Sicily, and this brought an end to the first phase of the war with the Carthaginians. But their rivalry would continue. Some 20 years later, the rivalry heats up and is going to break out in another war in the year 218, and it will last all the way until 201. The second phase of the war breaks out because the Romans and the Carthaginians were in competition for control of the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians, having lost Sicily, moved to take control of the Mediterranean coast of what we know today as Spain. And the border between Spain and, the border there in Spain between what is supposed to be the Carthaginian territory and the Roman territory was the Ebro River. The Carthaginian expansion into what we know today as Spain was led by Hamilcar and Hasdrubal, and they successfully subjugated the coast of Spain. And yet, in the next generation, as the Romans expanded beyond the Ebro River to Saguntum, the Carthaginians decided they needed to attack this settlement, and this is going to lead to the war. The Carthaginians would be led particularly by Hannibal. In his name, you see something of the continued Phoenician culture. His name is Hannibal. You might recognize Baal as part of his name, or in his earlier generation relative, Hasdrubal. Again, you have Baal as part of his name. So, the Romans come to conflict with these people that are very much influenced by Levantine culture. And Hannibal is an exceptional military leader. He will take war elephants that he's come to learn to use across the Alps and invade the Italian peninsula and seek to subjugate the Romans' allies, trying to get them to come to his side, and he succeeds in the case of some cities. But the cities that are closest to Rome remain loyal to Rome, perhaps because of the great fear of what would happen, but also because they have some common identity in language and in culture that's developed over the years. And so we're going to find that Hannibal will win tremendous victories, like the battle at Cannae, where he's going to kill some 40,000 Roman soldiers. But he's going to fail in subverting the Roman allies and conquering Rome. He wins every battle that he fights there in the Italian peninsula. Armies are raised up, brought against him, and he defeats them. But he doesn't have the technology that's needed to besiege the city of Rome And so he has to live off the land. And as he lives off the land, this certainly brings hostility amongst the common folks who live around about, whose food he happens to eat. He and his men are living off the land, and as a result, engender some local hostility. The Romans eventually come up with a strategy for defeating Hannibal. Since they can't defeat him there in Italy, they take the battle to Carthage. And Scipio Africanus leads an army that goes to Africa and attacks Carthage, whereupon the Carthaginian elders call for Hannibal to return. His problem, however, is that he doesn't have the naval resources that he needs to bring his Numidian cavalry. And as a result, when they fight at the Battle of Zama in North Africa, Hannibal's army will be defeated, and the Second Punic War will come to an end. Now, Hannibal himself will survive to escape to the area of the Balkan Peninsula, what we know today as Greece, and then move on into what we know today as Turkey. And he would continue to oppose the expansion of the Romans and ally with the Hellenistic forces that would be over in the areas of the Balkan Peninsula and in Anatolia. The Romans continue to have hostilities against the Carthaginians, to see them as a rival. And so for 50 years there's something of an uneasy peace, but along the way we find that there's a statesman in the Roman government by the name of Cato the Censor. Censor is an important role in the Senate of the Romans that we haven't yet talked about. But every time Cato got an opportunity, he would always pound on the podium and proclaim Carthagio delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He continued to see it as a challenge to the Roman way of life and a threat to Rome. And so he might, for example, bring figs and show these ripe figs and say, these were just picked 2 days ago in Carthage. We have a mortal enemy that is right on our borders that is a threat to us. So he's always agitating for war to pick up against the Carthaginians. Eventually, in the year 149, war will break out, and the Carthaginians, with their Greek-speaking allies, will be defeated, and the city of Corinth, which had allied with the Carthaginians, and the Achaean League that it was leading, would be defeated. And the result would be that the city of Corinth would be totally destroyed, along with the city of Carthage, where they would sow salt in the fields to try to limit its agricultural productivity and to kill the city that way. So Rome survives this great challenge to its existence and comes to be the dominant power in the western Mediterranean, and has begun its expansion towards the east as it comes to conquer the Greeks. What we're going to find is it's going to be conquered by the Greeks as they adopt a lot of Greek culture, and they bring a lot of Greek slaves who sometimes they use to teach their children. There will be other challenges that exist that are external challenges, like piracy, which will challenge the formation of Rome as they grow, and they grow increasingly dependent upon having imported food to feed the masses that are accumulating in Rome. Piracy will be a real challenge to them. But the result of all these external challenges are varied, but amongst them we'll find that in face of the Etruscans was the creation of the Republic in the year 509 BC. As the Romans threw off their Roman kings and ideas about the autocracy of such rulers, they didn't want to be ruled by kings, and so they instead established a republic that was under a senate. The senate would be the chief deliberative body leading this early republic. Its name is seen in an abbreviation that is put on their coins. Sometimes on coins or on banners you might see the letters SPQR. This stands for Senatus Populusque Romanum. The Romans didn't have a written constitution, but the traditions that they developed focused upon the Senate and the people of Rome. Now, as the Senate first emerges, it's dominated by wealthy families, and they pretty much look after their own interests. And this is going to lead to some problems internally for the Roman Empire that's going to develop. But the development of the Senate helped to preserve a sense of Roman identity, and it would initially hold these people together. Now there's some problems as it begins, and those will be addressed here a little bit later. Another result from the challenges, the external challenges of the Roman Empire, was the development of its military. They organized into legions and centuries, and the Roman army was one that used citizen soldiers, people who could afford their own weapons, and defended the common good. This military early on began embarking on improving communications through the construction of roads that they could travel quickly upon without getting bogged down in the wet of the winter mud, and that their wheels wouldn't sink up to their axles in the mud. But the Romans appear to have had some aspirations for expansion, and this is going to drive them all along the way. And we'll find that later on, by the time of the Roman Empire, they have a sense of divine mission, that they're seen to be a particularly pious group of people that the gods would obviously want to bless and dominate the world. So we've looked at some external challenges, but we want to move on to talk about internal challenges that they faced. As the Roman people living there on the banks of the Tiber River operated together, they lived and operated much like the early Jews had, with tribes and clans, and they had much of the same kind of problems that we see in the book of Judges, where sometimes blood was thicker than water. And the result was there were lots of revenge killings that took place, and vendettas that existed between families and tribes. And so this would be a serious internal problem that they would have as this new republic would be established. In response to that, something they developed fairly early on in the republic was something known as the 12 Tables. Like peoples who lived at earlier times in the Levant, they developed written laws. This would mean that people could understand the laws, and the laws didn't change based upon who you were. So the 12 Tables are an important response to the tribal tendencies of the Romans, and are going to help them build a society that's based upon law. Roman law is going to be an important contribution that they make to Western civilization. The next great challenge that faced this new republic was social division, the so-called struggle of the orders. Roman society was divided into the patricians. This would be wealthy landowners who came from affluent leading families of tribes. And then the second group were the plebeians, the common folks who were small farmers, artisans, and the like. These two groups of people made up the Roman citizenry, but the patricians had their advantages. They saw themselves as the father of the nation, and were rather paternalistic. The plebeians did most of the work, and so as a result there were some tensions that had developed. Amongst the early laws, there were laws against intermarrying between these two classes of people. So there were social distinctions which were embedded within laws. And this is going to lead to some struggles within this new republic following the year 509 when it was established. If you have potential threats, well, who's going to fight? Well, the majority of the fighters are going to be plebeians who go to war, these citizen soldiers who go to war, and they want to have more of a say in government. The patricians dominate the Senate, and they can make laws that the plebeians don't know anything about and don't understand, and that yet they're subject to. So the plebeians wanted to have greater participation in government. And in response to that, in the year 494, the Roman society develops the tribunate. Two tribunes were elected by a plebeian assembly, and these tribunes sat in the doorways of the Senate and could veto discussion that the Senate had. Basically, the word veto means I forbid. And if a tribune vetoed discussions, basically the Senate had to close the doors and go home for the day. They couldn't talk about making that law that might give advantages to the patricians any further. So how in the world did the plebeians gain this right to have a tribune? Well, the plebeians threatened to immigrate. So if we don't have any ability to participate in this government, well then if we just go away, then Rome's going to be vulnerable to its enemies, and as a result the patricians made concessions and they gave them this new position of the tribune. But this wasn't the end of extending participation of Roman citizens in government amongst the plebeians. Eventually, over time, as they face various challenges, the plebeian assembly gains the right to make plebiscites, and under the Hortensian laws around the year 287, basically if the plebeian assembly made laws, the Senate couldn't countermand those laws. They had to obey those laws made by the people. Again, this is not just all the men and women, this is just the male citizens who are voting in their centuries. But internal problems continue to dog the Roman society. Some of these will come out of the area of economics. As the Romans fight various wars and they win, many times they bring home slaves. Some slaves are sacrificed to the gods. The Romans would engage in gladiatorial games, a custom that they embraced from the Etruscans earlier on, where they basically sacrificed prisoners of war to the gods in that manner. But those that they didn't sacrifice served as slaves. Now, sometimes those slaves brought ideas with them, like the Greek slaves would bring with them, as they sometimes become pedagogues who taught Roman children from affluent families, and so they might be instructional slaves that lived in the household. Others would work in difficult circumstances like the mines, which is a virtual death sentence because of the atmosphere in which people worked, where they didn't have dynamite and they would use fire to heat rocks, and then you throw cold water on those hot rocks and they would shatter. But as you work in that environment and breathe all that smoke, a person's life expectancy is rather short. But the dependence upon slavery would have some adverse effects on the Roman traditions, where you had citizen soldiers and people who worked the land and built homes for themselves and were rather self-sufficient. They become more dependent upon specialists, and some people are going to be pushed off their land because of the economic situation, where the rich continue to get richer and the poor get poorer. This is going to be particularly true when the Romans expand their forces towards the north, fighting against Germanic peoples of Europe, who, unlike the Greeks and others to the east, who, when the Romans defeated them, they were able to bring all sorts of treasures home to Rome. When you fight up in Europe, there's not a whole lot of movable loot to bring home that people would value in great ways. And so people would fight long years of warfare and then not be able to bring home trophies and valuables that made going to war worthwhile. And this is going to have an effect on Roman society. The result would be that many Romans are going to be disenfranchised when they can't afford to purchase weapons by which they could fight. They don't have this way to gain wealth, and the Roman armies are threatened as they don't have people who have something at stake in the battle that they're going to fight. This is going to lead to civil wars in Rome as these economic troubles gnaw away at Roman traditions and change people's loyalties from being loyal to the Senate and the people of Rome. We're going to find that people are going to increasingly become loyal to generals who lead armies along the way. So we're going to see that this takes place as people are dispossessed and no longer have access to land. They get to be poorer and poorer, and there gets to be a large unemployed group of people who live in the city of Rome, who are hungry, who are susceptible to demagogues who come along telling them what they want to hear. In response to this circumstance, around the year 133, the Gracchi brother emerge as politicians who seek to address this issue. Tiberius Gracchus was a supporter of the plebeians and What he proposed was a distribution of the public land, the ager publicus, and the creation of colonies, whereby veterans who had gone to war for Rome would be given territories and lands that they could exploit as a reward for their having gone to war. This is popular in many circles, but the problem was that many of the patricians, the affluent families, had dominated the ager publicus and created a program of latifundia where they used the public lands for themselves, and so they didn't want to share the public lands. They didn't want to have walls put up which would keep them from exploiting the public resources of these fields. Tiberius Gracchus is subsequently assassinated for his efforts, and his brother Gaius Gracchus will be a fellow who will rise up a few years later and follow something the same policy, where he's going to promote the provision of bread for hungry people in Rome, and that way the plebeians are satisfied. But he'll continue this plan of trying to redistribute land and to create colonies, and this leads to some political divisions within the Senate in Rome, and a civil war is going to break out that's going to last for most of 100 years as the Romans seek to resolve the fact that they've changed from being an agrarian community to the center of an urban empire. Now, in the midst of all this civil war that's going to go on, there are factions amongst the Romans. One group, known as the Populares, will be in struggles against the Optimates, and the Romans will fight something known as the Social War. The champion of the Populares will be a general by the name of Marius. The champion of the Optimates will be Sulla. Marius is going to be successful early on, and one of the things that he's going to do is that he's going to remove the requirement that soldiers bring their own weapons to the battle. He will provide weapons for his men, and they will become loyal to him, as he's going to guarantee that they get something for having gone to war, rather than the soldiers being loyal to the Senate and the people of Rome. People are interested in fighting in their own self-interest. The Optimates, led by Sulla, basically are claiming that they're led by the best rather than just the common folks. And there'll be a rivalry between these two factions in Rome for some time. Initially, the Populares have their advantages as Marius defeats a rebellion that takes place in Numidia, led by Jugurtha, an African general. And then later on, as he'll lead armies successfully against the Germans, like the Teutones up in Europe. So there are successes, but he doesn't defeat anybody who really has great treasure troves to bring home and to reward his men. Instead, what he can reward them with would be land in colonies. As the Senate struggles with this factionalism, the forces of the Optimates come to power, led by Sulla. Sulla will be brutal against his rivals. A lot of people will be executed, and their property will be confiscated as a result. But amongst Sulla's lieutenants, he has a young man by the name of Pompey, and Pompey is going to help him deal with a piracy problem. Rome was dependent upon food coming from North Africa to feed the hungry bellies of the growing population of the people of Rome. By keeping them satisfied, he's able to keep down the threat of civil war there in Rome. And Pompey is going to be given authority, imperium, as the Romans would call it, to fight piracy. And we're going to find that he's very successful. And as a result, some people consider him to be the Roman Alexander the Great. But something that develops here in this time, the late Republic, is that we have the military coming to be loyal to their generals rather than the Senate. This would be a serious problem. Now, if these internal challenges weren't enough, in the midst of all of this, we also have slave revolts that take place. As Rome has taken many people captive, not all those people feel like they have anything at stake in the Roman Empire, and they aspire to gain their freedom. And a particularly famous slave revolt is that led by Spartacus, a man who was a gladiator as he's able to secure real weapons rather than the wooden weapons that they typically practice with. Spartacus will lead a revolt that will center particularly on Mount Vesuvius, south of Rome. This is before the volcano blows its top. But the Romans will have a very hard time suppressing this slave revolt. And when they do it very, very brutally. All along the Appian Way, they crucified slaves. So can you imagine going down a highway, and every time that there's a telephone post, you have a body on display showing this is what happens to people who rebel against Rome. The Romans were very brutal in dealing with slaves who might rebel against their masters. All the slaves of a household would be executed if a slave were to kill his master. So they have some serious social problems amongst themselves, and the Roman society is very much factionalized. And the structure of the Republic, with its two censors, these magistrates who rule for a brief period of time and then they're out of office, are going to be challenged. They have laws, but yet people, instead of being loyal to the laws and the institution of governments, have come increasingly to be loyal to generals who guarantee their rewards. And so we see in the late Republic the rise of a number of people we might describe as being dictators. Both Marius and Sulla I would describe as being dictators. They might have maintained something of the facade of the Roman Senate, but in fact they called the shots. In response to all of this trouble, we're going to find that there will grow to be a secret alliance between three individuals that will subvert the Republic in what's known as the First Triumvirate. It's an alliance between three powerful political figures around the year 60 BC. The first of these was a wealthy man by the name of Crassus. He had made himself wealthy because he had bought up property at fire sale prices. When a person knew that they were going to be condemned by Sulla, before they were executed, if they could get their property sold, then their property could go to their descendants. But if they are executed and their property hadn't been sold, then the state commandeered their property. And so, being very wealthy, he was able to buy things at fire sale prices, and so the richest man in Rome got to be richer and richer. The result was, however, that he was rather hated and feared within Roman society, and the Senate didn't want to give him anything. He aspired to political office and aspired to military glory. The Senate would never give him a command of armies. And so he wanted to be a general. And this is something he's going to secretly ally together to get. The second participant was Pompey. Pompey, the young lieutenant of Sulla, who had succeeded in crushing the pirates that had been threatening to starve the Romans, had expanded Roman territory eastward, as the pirate problem wasn't just between Sicily and Rome, but it was all along the coasts of the Mediterranean. And so he was given imperium anywhere within 50 miles of the coast to crush the pirate problem. Now the fact is, he very quickly did this by isolating pirates. He was able to attack them at their bases and to deal with the pirate problem actually rather quickly, but he didn't, like Cincinnatus, immediately lay down his imperium. Instead, he continued to persist in driving along the coast of the Mediterranean, and where there were troubles, he basically worked to resolve them. One of the troubles that he would resolve would be a civil war amongst the Hasmoneans. Two brothers were in competition for being the king and high priest of the Jews, and so he will resolve that difficulty, and the Romans will become much more directly involved in the affairs of the Jews all the way in the east. And the Jews will become a client kingdom servile to the Romans. The third great player here in the First Triumvirate was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a fellow who had connections with Marius, and he had accomplished a great deal as a general, gained great renown for his governorship in Cisalpine Gaul. His Gallic Wars, which move into Transalpine Gaul, are a record of accomplishment in defeating these fierce people who live in what we know today as France. and he would have aspirations even of expanding westward to Britain, to cross the English Channel. But he'll never succeed in doing that. We'll have to wait to one of his successors. But Julius Caesar wanted to have political glory, and the Roman Senate feared him. He was very successful, and so having won battles against his enemies, he wanted to come back to Rome with his armies and celebrate a triumph. This was acceptable to the Roman Senate, but the Roman Senate didn't allow generals with armies in town to, at the same time, run for political office, and he wanted to run for the position of consul. And so he's going to be restricted in his ability to run for political office. Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar worked together to get what they wanted. They subverted the Senate. They used their power and influence to get what they wanted. So as a result, the Senate is marginalized, and Crassus is given a military command where he wants to go fight and win glory against the Persians, a long-term enemy of the Romans in the east. He gains what he wants, but eventually in the year 53 he's going to get himself killed. So this is going to cause some imbalance in this triumvirate. You don't have the tripod of 3 legs stand upon, you now have 2 legs, and these 2 legs are going to find themselves in competition with each other. Now, in order to cement this alliance, Pompey had the Senate ratify all the judgments he had made over in the Levant, and his soldiers were rewarded with the treasures that he had been able to bring home. The Senate agreed to these things, so this gave him great power. And Julius Caesar gained what he wanted, and then he goes off to war again, and the Senate comes to be cozier with Pompey. And the result is that the Senate is going to recall Caesar. They're going to call him from Cisalpine Gaul, that would be the Po River Valley, and tell him to come back to Rome without his armies. Fearing what would happen without his armies to support him and protect him, Julius Caesar decides to defy the Senate, and the result is the beginnings of a civil war. This civil war would be one between Julius Caesar on one side and the forces of Pompey on the other. The famous line that he's attributed to saying is, "The die is cast," as he crosses the Rubicon River. Now, the Rubicon River is not too much of a body of water. It's a little stream. But importantly, it was the boundary between Gaul and Italy. And in crossing it with his armies, Caesar declared war. Pompey and the Senate weren't ready for this, and the armies of Julius Caesar were quickly in Rome, and they had to flee. And in this struggle for empire, Julius Caesar is going to be successful. Pompey will flee to the east, but as he flees down to Egypt, rather than being welcomed as somebody who'd made local arrangements at an earlier time, he will be assassinated. And the efforts of the Senate to restore their power under Pompey was lost, and Julius Caesar becomes a virtual dictator. Now, he still maintains the Senate. It still meets, but he pushes through aspects of his own legislation. These would include achievements like various public work projects, like creating better sewers to drain the Forum. This is something that everybody benefited from. Or cleaning out aqueducts, improving roads. But he also moved towards creating colonies where soldiers could be retired, and moved towards adopting the Egyptian solar calendar in Rome. While he can be attributed with a number of positive accomplishments, he failed to keep the Roman Senate on his side, and so they would plot against him, even people that he trusted. And the result would be that on the Ides of March in the year 44, people who were pro-Republican assassinated him as he came to speak in the Senate, ironically at the foot of Pompey's statue. In response to that, the Republicans thought they would restore the city. But instead, forces loyal to Julius Caesar are going to be able to win hearts and minds in Rome and the Republican forces are going to find themselves on the outs with the populace. This is brought about through an alliance between Mark Antony, who's the lieutenant of Julius Caesar, Octavian, his adopted son, and Lepidus, another wealthy man and politician in Rome. These three publicly devote themselves to avenging Caesar. And as Caesar is cremated in Roman fashion, his will is read to the Roman people, and half of his immense estate was given to the Roman people. It's hard for people to despise somebody who's left them in their will. The result is that public attention is turned away from the claims of the Republicans, and they become unpopular, and the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian are going to be successful in driving them out of Italy, eventually over to the Balkan Peninsula, where they'll be defeated at Philippi. This is the location where later on we'll have Paul going, and then a letter is written to the Philippians in the New Testament. So Mark Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus publicly announce their alliance together, and they get what they want. Mark Antony is given the eastern part of the Roman-dominated territory to look after, the most populous and prosperous part. Octavian rules in Rome and works with the Senate. And over in the east, there's an attempt at an alliance between Mark Antony and Octavian that's sealed by a marriage arrangement where Mark Antony is married to Octavia, the sister of Octavian, and this is supposed to seal the alliance. But as Mark Antony goes to the east, he comes in time to be enamored with Cleopatra, who had mothered a child of Julius Caesar, Caesarion. And so Mark Antony is going to claim to be something the protector of Caesar's child. And in time, he divorces Octavia. This leads to a rift between Mark Antony in the east and Octavian in the west. Lepidus, who had gained control of North Africa and had responsibilities there, soon died, leaving there then once again a conflict between two individuals. Eventually we're going to see that Octavian, who's going to gain the name Augustus, is going to succeed in defeating the forces of Mark Antony. This is accomplished particularly at the Battle of Actium in the year 31 BC. In the east, Mark Antony had loyal subjects like Herod the Great, who would have fought for him if he could, but in competition for Antony's attention with Cleopatra, Herod lost out and as a result was embroiled by Cleopatra in a war with the Nabatean Arabs, rather than coming to fight the Battle of Actium. The Battle of Actium is on the west coast of the Balkan Peninsula, and later on there's a city built there called Nicopolis. That city is mentioned in the pastoral epistles in the New Testament, a place that Paul visited sometime, but we don't have any record in Luke's account in the book of Acts of that specific visit. But it's a naval battle that's won by the forces of Octavian, and subsequently, a couple years later, the Senate decides to give him the name Augustus. That means revered one. So here, early on in the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, what we found is that there's a transition that's coming about. They were established with a Senate in the year 509. They've survived all kinds of internal and external troubles, but things change with the coming of the rule of Augustus as he defeats Mark Antony. Mark Antony will eventually die, and Cleopatra will commit suicide rather than living on, and as a result, Octavian will become the sole ruler of the Roman Empire in the year 31 BC, and he's going to have a very, very long reign all the way up until AD 14. But he's going to help to provide a political situation that made the time right. The political situation of the Romans made the time right for the coming of the Messiah. Roman rule had helped to establish the Hasmonean Jewish state back in the middle of the 2nd century BC as they curtailed the the foreign policies of the Seleucids, and as the Seleucids had been conquered by the Romans in what we know as Turkey, back at the turn of the 2nd century, the Jewish state had emerged as an independent state, but it had good relations with the Romans. Initially, as the Romans move into the area of the Levant, they establish indirect Roman rule through client kings. They called the shots as towards which brother would become the king, and so Pompey gives some cities their freedoms. Cities like Gadara gets its freedom from Pompey, but we don't have direct Roman rule up until the year AD 6. This is something that Augustus changes in the later part of his life. But there are some Jews who don't like the coming of the Romans. They want to have an independent state of their own. They don't like to pay taxes to Rome and be subservient to Rome. They want to pursue their own interest. And this will lead many people to be looking for a Messiah, a Savior from this situation. Now, the religious situation of the Romans also helped to bring about the right time in Palestine. The Romans religiously were polytheistic. They engaged in pluralism like the Greeks. They had been able to mix and match their gods. The Greeks, oh, your god Zeus is our god Jupiter. They'd done this throughout their pantheon. But the focus of the Romans typically was on civic religion and not really based upon anything terribly intellectual of their religion. They never engaged in systematic theology, but they were concerned about piety. They thought that because they had been faithful to the gods and kept the gods happy, the gods had given them victory in war. But the Romans, like the Greeks who they had defeated, were hungry for better answers to eternal questions than their capricious gods gave them. Jupiter, like Zeus, was immoral, engaged in all kinds of capricious troubles with his family. And so the Romans embraced aspects of Hellenistic philosophy, particularly Stoicism. They also were enamored with the mystery religions. They were also interested in the Jewish witness that the diaspora, the Jewish expatriate community, brought as they encountered them in places like Alexandria in Egypt, and as Jews were doing business and building synagogues around the area of Turkey. They encountered the Jews and were interested in this singular God. Sometimes they'd be offended by their cultural practices. But the Romans had established a toleration of Judaism, particularly as Julius Caesar, in consolidating his hold on the empire and defeating Pompey, had gone to Egypt. And when he had gone to Alexandria, where a quarter of the population was Jewish, they had come alongside him and helped him to be successful militarily. And as a result, in spite of their odd religious practices, he declared that they were a legal religion, in Latin, a regio licita. This would have implications for a long time for the Jews in the Roman Empire, and early on for the Christians. The Roman political domination certainly helped promote Jewish messianic expectation, and it also created a socioeconomic situation that made the time right for the coming of Roman, for the time right for the coming of the Messiah. As we look in Western society and think about what the Roman Republic has passed on to us, certainly they gained much from the Greeks, but what we get from them is ideas about law in particular. We're going to find they're also going to be making some developments in the area of architecture, and certainly their concern about civic infrastructure would be something that would be important. Economically, they're going to promote long-distance trade. We're going to find that in the Roman Empire they use Latin in the West, but that Greek continued to be the dominant language in the East. And so these languages will have a great deal of influence on subsequent Western society. As we conclude today, we want to see is that God responded to the plight of mankind in a sinful, fallen world by sending Jesus into the world in the first century. His timing was something that was prophesied in Messianic prophecy. If we look in the book of Daniel, his timing took advantage of a context that was greatly shaped by the Romans. Now, there would still be great obstacles for the spread of the gospel, but through God's providence, these things would be overcome. What we see is the sovereign Lord of history causes nations to rise and fall to accomplish his purposes, and certainly he worked through the Romans. It's an interesting thing to think about how God works in time. Certainly from Roman society we have a lot of things from the Greeks, from Hellenistic society, that is modified in certain ways and passed on into later European society. So it's interesting to think about, God's purposes in our time, and to be looking to see God's providence in our life. Thank you for your attention.